Disclaimer: this video is an imagination written by author's perspective. It has nothing to do with real life. It's only for entertainment purpose. I own the storyline and narration, so please don't copy and repost my work. Thank you. Mrs. John and that best girl was pregnant with someone else's child. Teary eyes. Mrs. John sat and Jungkook became shocked. It's hard for him to believe that Ruby was pregnant with someone else's child. He looked at his father and his father also nodded. Jungkook can't believe on his own ears that his love was cheating on him and she was carrying someone else's child. Jungkook's eyes became teary and his heart started aching. Mr. Jeon, your mom is right, Jungkook. Ruby was pregnant with someone else's baby. Jungkook, but how did you know, mom and dad? Jungkook asked with confused face. Mrs. Jeon, look Jungkook, you introduced Ruby to us and we liked her in first meeting. And you also told us that you wants to marry her and we also agreed to that because we thought she is good. Mrs. John, we also find her perfect for you. But one day me and your father went to hospital for my checkup and we saw Ruby there with a guy. Flashback. Mr. and Mrs. John both come to the hospital for Mrs. John monthly checkup and they both were walking towards doctor's cabin and from another side Ruby is coming with her boyfriend. Ruby is feeling so weak, that's why she was looking down, and Mrs. John was also looking at Mr. John, and they both didn't saw each other, and they both bumped into each other. Ruby was holding her reports in her hand when she bumped into Mrs. John. Mrs. John picked at reports and she saw that it's pregnancy reports. Mrs. John and Ruby became shocked when they both saw each other. Ruby tried to take her reports from Mrs. John, but Mrs. John didn't give her reports and started checking her reports. At first, Mrs. John thought Ruby is carrying Jungkook's child. But then she saw a man with Ruby. Mrs. John, who is he? She said while pointing towards him. Ruby. He is shuddering. Man, I am her boyfriend, he said and take her reports from Mrs. John and left with Ruby. Now Mr. and Mrs. John both are shocked. End of flashback. Mrs. John, after that we went to that doctor who checked her and she told us that Ruby come here for the abortion. Then we find everything about her and got to know that she is a playgirl. Mrs. John, she was using you and many other men for her luxury. She was very sharp and she really played well with you and your mind. Mrs. John said with sad expressions. Mr. John, before we can find evidence against her to show you, she removed everything and destroyed every evidence. We wanted to tell you everything, but you trust her more than anything. Jungkook can't believe that Ruby can do this. He trusted her more than his family, but in return he gets this from her. Jungkook loved her so much, but she cheated him. He was already suffering and broken, but Ruby's reality broke him more. It's hard for him to accept this truth. He always find her perfect, and now he got to know about her reality. Jungkook, but mom, why you drag Vine in all this? Why you forced us to marry each other? Now she is also suffering because of us. Jungkook said with teary eyes. Mrs. John, but Jungkook, I told her everything about this and she still wants to marry you. So what can I do? I am feeling sorry for her, but she chose this with her own will. Mrs. John, she wanted to marry you because she fell in love with you in first meeting. and she thought she'll change you and you'll forget about Ruby after marriage. Now Jungkook is feeling more heartbroken because first he got married without his will, and then his wife and daughter left him when he was trying to change, and now he got to know about his girlfriend reality. He is so sad now. First of all, he was blaming himself for everything, and now he got to know about his love reality. Mrs. Sean, we are sorry, Jungkook. Mrs. John, we didn't tell you anything because we don't get proofs against her, and we forced you to marry Ryan and always forced you to accept her. Teary eyes. Jungkook, no mom, it's okay. Now I am used to it. Jungkook smiled painfully and left for his room. Mrs. John, but listen, son. He didn't stop and left from there. He always said it's okay and never showed his pain. Maybe that's why no one supported him in his hard time. Mrs. John always supported you, but no one supported him and see his pain. You and Mrs. John always thought that he is a man, that's why he is strong and he can move on easily. But only Jungkook knows about his mental breakdown and pain. Jungkook came in his room and locked the room from inside and started crying his heart out. It's very hard for him to accept that Ruby was pregnant with someone else's child and she cheated on him. He is feeling more guilty because for a cheater he was avoiding his family and child. But from his perspective, he was also not wrong because he loved someone truly. Loving someone is not wrong, and Jungkook accepts his mistakes, but he is not at fault either because his parents didn't tell him anything and just forced him to marry a random girl. Jungkook, I just loved a girl truly. Then why did I get all this in return? I know I did wrong with Ryan, but if Ryan was in my place, she would have done the same thing. Teary eyes. Jungkook, that day I was stressed and needy because I drink a little bit alcohol. And when I come home, Ryan was the one who submit herself to me. I didn't force her. He's saying right, that night he didn't force Ryan, and Ryan was the one who didn't stop him because she also wanted him. Actually, you loved him, that's why you wanted him. You were also selfish in his love. You know everything that he loves someone else, and on the first day, he told you that he'll give you divorce, and you don't want to give him divorce. And that day you thought that if you'll give yourself to him, then he'll not leave you. You were also selfish in his love. Then you get pregnant and thought now he'll accept you. Jungkook, it's okay, Jungkook. Maybe you don't deserve to be loved. That's why everyone do this with you. He sad and started crying so hard. His parents can hear his crying sound from outside. They are feeling sorry for Jungkook because they forced him and always said that he is worst dad and husband. One week later, Jungkook is sick because he is not eating properly from last week and he is not going to office. Right now he is sitting in the garden alone because he needs some fresh air. Just then his parents come there with some fruits and juice and give it to him, but he refused to eat them. Mrs. John, Jungkook's son. Mrs. John, please eat something. You became so weak, son. She sat with teary eyes, and Jungkook's eyes also became teary. Jungkook, I'm already weak, mom, who can't save his family and lost everything after trying so hard. He sat with teary eyes. Jungkook, no mom, I don't want to eat anything. He was about to get up and left from there, but his mom held his hand. Mrs. John, don't worry, Jungkook. I'll talk to Ryan and she'll definitely forgive you. Don't worry, son, but eat something for us, Mrs. John said, and Jungkook smiled. Jungkook, no mom, I don't deserve her in my life. I was wrong and she don't deserve a husband like me, he said with teary eyes. To be continued. Thanks for watching.